This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Moira Fogarty. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by Charles Dent. Prefatory sketch. Charles Dent, the author of the following remarkable stories, was born in Kendal, Westmorland, England, in 1841. His parents emigrated to Canada shortly after that event, bringing with them, of course, the youth who was afterwards to become the Canadian author and historian. Mr. Dent received his primary education in Canadian schools, and afterwards studied law, becoming in due course a member of the Upper Canada Bar. He only practised for a few years. He found the profession profitable enough, but uncongenial, as it could not well help being in an obscure Canadian village 20 years ago, and very probably he was already cherishing ambitious dreams of literary labours, which he was eager to begin in the world's literary centre, London. He accordingly relinquished his practice as soon as he felt himself in a position to do so, and went to England. He had not miscalculated his powers, as too many do under like circumstances. He soon found remunerative literary work, and as he became better known, was engaged to write for several high-class periodicals, notably Once a Week, for which he contributed a series of articles on interesting topics. But in England Mr. Dent produced no very long or ambitious work. Perhaps he found that the requisite time for such an undertaking could not be spared. At this period he had a wife and family depending on him for support, and it speaks well for his abilities that he was able to amply provide for them out of the profits solely derived from his literary labours. But of course to do this he had to devote himself to work that could be thrown off readily, and which could be as readily sold. After remaining in England for several years, Mr. Dent and his family returned to America. He obtained a position in Boston, which he held for about 2 years. But he finally relinquished it and came to Toronto, having accepted a position on the editorial staff of the Telegram, which was then just starting. For several years Mr. Dent devoted himself to journalistic labours on various newspapers, but principally the Toronto Weekly Globe. To that journal he contributed a very notable series of biographical sketches on eminent Canadians. Shortly after the death of the Honourable George Brown, Mr. Dent severed his connection with the Globe, and immediately thereafter commenced his first ambitious undertaking, the Canadian Portrait Gallery, which ran to 4 large volumes. It proved to be a most creditable and successful achievement. Of course, in a brief sketch no detailed criticism of either this or the succeeding works can be attempted. Suffice it to say that the biographies of Canadian public men, living and dead, were carefully prepared and written from an unpartisan standpoint. In this book there was no padding. Every individual admitted had achieved something of national value, and the biographies are, therefore, of importance to the student of Canadian history. This book deserved and attained a considerable circulation, and brought to its author a comparatively large sum of money. Mr. Dent's second book was The Last 40 Years, Canada Since the Union of 1841. This work has been highly praised in all quarters, and is in every way a credit to its author's really brilliant powers as a literary artist. The third work was A History of the Rebellion in Upper Canada. Although written in his best manner, with the greatest possible care, from authentic sources of information not hitherto accessible, this work has had the misfortune to meet with undeservedly severe criticism. When Mr. Dent began his studies for the book, he held William Lyon Mackenzie in high esteem, but he found it necessary afterwards to change his opinion. He was able to throw a flood of new light on the characters of the men who took part in the struggle, and if the facts tended to darken the fair fame of some of them, the historian certainly ought not to be censured for it. The tendency of the book was decidedly in opposition to the ideas entertained to this day by the partisans of the "Old Family Compact" on the one side, and also to the friends and admirers of William Lyon Mackenzie on the other. But the severe criticism the work sustained has left it stronger than before, and it will stand undoubtedly as by far the best history of the rebellion that has appeared. In addition to these important works on which his reputation as a writer will rest, Mr. Dent has written from time to time a great many sketches, essays, and stories, some of which are exceedingly interesting and worthy of being preserved. All of Mr. Dent's work contains a charm of its own. In writing history he was in accord with Macaulay. He always believed that a true story should be told as agreeably as a fictitious one; that the incidents of a real life, whether political or domestic, admit of being so arranged as, without detriment to accuracy, to command all the interest of an artificial series of facts; that the chain of circumstances which constitute history may be as finely and gracefully woven as any tale of fancy. Acting upon this theory, he has made Canadian history very interesting reading. He is to my mind the only historian, beside Mr. Parkman, who has been able to make Canadian events so dry in detail, fascinating throughout. In private life Mr. Dent was a most estimable man. He possessed qualities of mind and heart, having their visible outcome in a courteous, genial manner that endeared him very closely to his friends. With all his wealth of learning, which was very great, he was light-hearted, witty, and companionable, and his early death leaves a gap not very easily closed. The 4 stories composing the present volume were contributed by their author at considerable intervals to different periodicals. Some time prior to his death he contemplated publishing them in book form, and actually selected and carefully revised them with that purpose in view. He thought they were worthy of being rescued from obscurity, and if we compare them with much of a similar class of work constantly issuing from the press, we cannot think that his judgment erred. They are now published in accordance with his wish to take their chances in the great world of literature. R.W.D., Toronto, October 25th, 1888. End of Prefatory Sketch. Recorded in Toronto, Ontario, by Moira Fogarty, October 2006. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Moira Fogarty. The Gerrard Street Mystery by John Charles Dent. My name is William Francis Furlong. My occupation is that of a commission merchant, and my place of business is on St. Paul Street in the city of Montreal. I have resided in Montreal ever since shortly after my marriage in 1862 to my cousin Alice Plater of Toronto. My name may not be familiar to the present generation of Torontonians, though I was born in Toronto and passed the early years of my life there. Since the days of my youth my visits to the upper province have been few, and, with one exception, very brief, so that I have doubtless passed out of the remembrance of many persons with whom I was once on terms of intimacy. Still, there are several residents of Toronto whom I am happy to number among my warmest personal friends at the present day. There are also a good many persons of middle age, not in Toronto only, but scattered here and there throughout various parts of Ontario, who will have no difficulty in recalling my name as that of one of their fellow students at Upper Canada College. The name of my late uncle, Richard Yardington, is of course well known to all old residents of Toronto, where he spent the last 32 years of his life. He settled there in the year 1829, when the place was still known as Little York. He opened a small store on Yonge Street, and his commercial career was a reasonably prosperous one. By steady degrees the small store developed into what, in those times, was regarded as a considerable establishment. In the course of years the owner acquired a competency, and in 1854 retired from business altogether. From that time up to the day of his death he lived in his own house on Gerrard Street. After mature deliberation I have resolved to give to the Canadian public an account of some rather singular circumstances connected with my residence in Toronto. Though repeatedly urged to do so, I have hitherto refrained from giving any extended publicity to those circumstances, in consequence of my inability to see any good to be served thereby. The only person, however, whose reputation can be injuriously affected by the details has been dead for some years. He has left behind him no one whose feelings can be shocked by the disclosure, and the story is in itself sufficiently remarkable to be worth the telling. Told accordingly it shall be, and the only fictitious element introduced into the narrative shall be the name of one of the persons most immediately concerned in it. At the time of taking up his abode in Toronto, or rather in Little York, my Uncle Richard was a widower and childless, his wife having died several months previously. His only relatives on this side of the Atlantic were 2 maiden sisters, a few years younger than himself. He never contracted a second matrimonial alliance, and for some time after his arrival here his sisters lived in his house, and were dependent upon him for support. After the lapse of a few years, both of them married and settled down in homes of their own. The elder of them subsequently became my mother. She was left a widow when I was a mere boy, and survived my father only a few months. I was an only child, and as my parents had been in humble circumstances, the charge of my maintenance devolved upon my uncle, to whose kindness I am indebted for such educational training as I have received. After sending me to school and college for several years, he took me into his store, and gave me my first insight into commercial life. I lived with him, and both then and always received at his hands the kindness of a father, in which light I eventually almost came to regard him. His youngest sister, who was married to a watchmaker called Elias Plater, lived at Quebec from the time of her marriage until her death, which took place in 1846. Her husband had been unsuccessful in business, and was moreover of dissipated habits. He was left with one child, a daughter, on his hands, and as my uncle was averse to the idea of his sister's child remaining under the control of one so unfit to provide for her welfare, he proposed to adopt the little girl as his own. To this proposition Mr. Elias Plater readily assented, and little Alice was soon domiciled with her uncle and myself in Toronto. Brought up, as we were, under the same roof, and seeing each other every day of our lives, a childish attachment sprang up between my cousin Alice and myself. As the years rolled by, this attachment ripened into a tender affection, which eventually resulted in an engagement between us. Our engagement was made with the full and cordial approval of my uncle, who did not share the prejudice entertained by many persons against marriage between cousins. He stipulated, however, that our marriage should be deferred until I had seen somewhat more of the world, and until we had both reached an age when we might reasonably be presumed to know our own minds. He was also, not unnaturally, desirous that before taking upon myself the responsibility of marriage, I should give some evidence of my ability to provide for a wife, and for other contingencies usually consequent upon matrimony. He made no secret of his intention to divide his property between Alice and myself at his death, and the fact that no actual division would be necessary in the event of our marriage with each other was doubtless one reason for his ready acquiescence in our engagement. He was, however, of a vigorous constitution, strictly regular and methodical in all his habits, and likely to live to an advanced age. He could hardly be called parsimonious, but, like most men who have successfully fought their own way through life, he was rather fond of authority, and little disposed to divest himself of his wealth until he should have no further occasion for it. He expressed his willingness to establish me in business, either in Toronto or elsewhere, and to give me the benefit of his experience in all mercantile transactions. When matters had reached this pass, I had just completed my 21st year, my cousin being 3 years younger. Since my uncle's retirement I had engaged in 1 or 2 little speculations on my own account, which had turned out fairly successful, but I had not devoted myself to any regular or fixed pursuit. Before any definite arrangements had been concluded as to the course of my future life, a circumstance occurred which seemed to open a way for me to turn to good account such mercantile talent as I possessed. An old friend of my uncle's opportunely arrived in Toronto from Melbourne, Australia, where, in the course of a few years, he had risen from the position of a junior clerk to that of senior partner in a prominent commercial house. He painted the land of his adoption in glowing colours, and assured my uncle and myself that it presented an inviting field for a young man of energy and business capacity, more especially if he had a small capital at his command. The matter was carefully debated in our domestic circle. I was naturally averse to a separation from Alice, but my imagination took fire at Mr. Redpath's glowing account of his own splendid success. I pictured myself returning to Canada after an absence of 4 or 5 years, with a mountain of gold at my command, as the result of my own energy and acuteness. In imagination, I saw myself settled down with Alice, in palatial mansion on Jarvis Street, and living in affluence all the rest of my days. My uncle bade me consult my own judgment in the matter, but rather encouraged the idea than otherwise. He offered to advance me £500, and I had about half that sum as the result of my own speculations. Mr. Redpath, who was just about returning to Melbourne, promised to aid me to the extent of his power with his local knowledge and advice. In less than a fortnight from that time, he and I were on our way to the other side of the globe. We reached our destination early in the month of September 1857. My life in Australia has no direct bearing upon the course of events to be related, and may be passed over in a very few words. I engaged in various enterprises, and achieved a certain measure of success. If none of my ventures proved eminently prosperous, I at least met with no serious disasters. At the end of 4 years, that is to say, in September 1861, I made up my account with the world, and found I was worth $10,000. I had, however, become terribly homesick, and longed for the termination of my voluntary exile. I had, of course, kept up a regular correspondence with Alice and Uncle Richard, and of late they had both pressed me to return home. "You have enough," wrote my uncle, "to give you a start in Toronto, and I see no reason why Alice and you should keep apart any longer. You will have no housekeeping expenses, for I intend you to live with me. I am getting old, and shall be glad of your companionship in my declining years. You will have a comfortable home while I live, and when I die you will get all I have between you. Write as soon as you receive this, and let us know how soon you can be here. The sooner the better." The letter containing this pressing invitation found me in a mood very much disposed to accept it. The only enterprise I had on hand which would be likely to delay me was a transaction in wool, which, as I believed, would be closed by the end of January, or the beginning of February. By the 1st of March I should certainly be in a condition to start on my homeward voyage, and I determined that my departure should take place about that time. I wrote both to Alice and my uncle, apprising them of my intention, and announcing my expectation to reach Toronto not later than the middle of May. The letters so written were posted on the 19th of September, in time for the mail which left on the following day. On the 27th, to my huge surprise and gratification, the wool transaction referred to was unexpectedly concluded, and I was at liberty, if so disposed, to start for home by the next fast mail steamer, the Southern Cross, leaving Melbourne on the 11th of October. I was so disposed, and made my preparations accordingly. It was useless, I reflected, to write to my uncle or to Alice, acquainting them with the change in my plans, for I should take the shortest route home, and should probably be in Toronto as soon as a letter could get there. I resolved to telegraph from New York upon my arrival there, so as not to take them altogether by surprise. The morning of the 11th of October found me on board the Southern Cross, where I shook hands with Mr. Redpath and several other friends who accompanied me on board for a last farewell. The particulars of the voyage to England are not pertinent to the story, and may be given very briefly. I took the Red Sea route, and arrived at Marseilles about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 29th of November. From Marseilles I travelled by rail to Calais, and so impatient was I to reach my journey's end without loss of time, that I did not even stay over to behold the glories of Paris. I had a commission to execute in London, which, however, delayed me there only a few hours, and I hurried down to Liverpool, in the hope of catching the Cunard steamer for New York. I missed it by about 2 hours, but the Persia was detailed to start on a special trip to Boston the following day. I secured a berth, and at 8 o'clock the next morning steamed out of the Mersey on my way homeward. The voyage from Liverpool to Boston consumed 14 days. All I need say about it is, that before arriving at the latter port, I formed an intimate acquaintance with one of the passengers, Mr. Junius H. Gridley, a Boston merchant, who was returning from a hurried business trip to Europe. He was, and is, a most agreeable companion. We were thrown together a good deal during the voyage, and we then laid the foundation of a friendship which has ever since subsisted between us. Before the dome of the State House loomed in sight, he had extracted a promise from me to spend a night with him before pursuing my journey. We landed at the wharf in East Boston on the evening of the 17th of December, and I accompanied him to his house on West Newton Street, where I remained until the following morning. Upon consulting the time-table, we found that the Albany express would leave at 11:30 a.m. This left several hours at my disposal, and we sallied forth immediately after breakfast to visit some of the lions of the American Athens. In the course of our peregrinations through the streets, we dropped into the post office, which had recently been established in the Merchants' Exchange building on Slate Street. Seeing the countless piles of mail matter, I jestingly remarked to my friend that there seemed to be letters enough there to go around the whole human family. He replied in the same mood, whereupon I banteringly suggested the probability that among so many letters surely there ought to be one for me. "Nothing more reasonable," he replied. "We Bostonians are always bountiful to strangers. Here is the general delivery, and here is the department where letters addressed to the Furlong family are kept in stock. Pray inquire for yourself." The joke, I confess, was not a very brilliant one, but with a grave countenance I stepped up to the wicket, and asked the young lady in attendance, "Anything for W.F. Furlong?" She took from a pigeon-hole a handful of correspondence, and proceeded to run her eye over the addresses. When about half the pile had been exhausted, she stopped, and propounded the usual inquiry in case of strangers. "Where do you expect letters from?" "From Toronto," I replied. To my no small astonishment, she immediately handed me a letter bearing the Toronto postmark. The address was in the peculiar and well-known handwriting of my Uncle Richard. Scarcely crediting the evidence of my senses, I tore open the envelope and read as follows: "Toronto, 9th December, 1861. "My dear William, I am so glad to know that you are coming home so much sooner than you expected when you wrote last, and that you will eat your Christmas dinner with us. For reasons which you will learn when you arrive, it will not be a very merry Christmas at our house, but your presence will make it much more bearable than it would be without you. I have not told Alice that you are coming. Let it be a joyful surprise for her, as some compensation for the sorrows she has had to endure lately. You needn't telegraph. I will meet you at the GWR station. Your affectionate uncle, Richard Yardington." "Why, what's the matter?" asked my friend, seeing the blank look of surprise on my face. "Of course the letter is not for you. Why on earth did you open it?" It is for me," I answered. "See here, Gridley, old man, have you been playing me a trick? If you haven't, this is the strangest thing I ever knew in my life." Of course, he hadn't been playing me a trick. A moment's reflection showed me that such a thing was impossible. Here was the envelope, with the Toronto postmark of the 9th of December, at which time he had been with me on board the Persia on the banks of Newfoundland. Besides, he was a gentleman, and would not have played so poor and stupid a joke upon a guest. And, to put the matter beyond all possibility of doubt, I remembered that I had never mentioned my cousin's name in his hearing. I handed him the letter. He read it carefully through, twice over, and was as much mystified at its contents as myself; for during our passage across the Atlantic I had explained to him the circumstance under which I was returning home. By what conceivable means had my uncle been made aware of my departure from Melbourne? Had Mr. Redpath written to him, as soon as I acquainted that gentleman with my intentions? But even if such were the case, the letter could not have left before I did, and could not possibly have reached Toronto by the 9th of December. Had I been seen in England by some one who knew me, and had not one written from there? Most unlikely; and even if such a thing had happened, it was impossible that the letter could have reached Toronto by the 9th. I need hardly inform the reader that there was no telegraphic communication at that time. And how could my uncle know that I would take the Boston route? And if he had known, how could he foresee that I would do anything so absurd as to call at the Boston post office and inquire for letters? "I will meet you at the GWR station." How was he to know by what train I would reach Toronto, unless I notified him by telegraph, and that he expressly stated to be unnecessary? We did no more sightseeing. I obeyed the hint contained in the letter, and sent no telegram. My friend accompanied me down to the Boston and Albany station, where I waited in feverish impatience for the departure of the train. We talked over the matter until 11:30, in the vain hope of finding some clue to the mystery. Then I started on my journey. Mr. Gridley's curiosity was aroused, and I promised to send him an explanation immediately upon my arrival at home. No sooner had the train glided out of the station than I settled myself in my seat, drew the tantalising letter from my pocket, and proceeded to read and re-read it again and again. A very few perusals sufficed to fix its contents in my memory, so that I could repeat every word with my eyes shut. Still I continued to scrutinise the paper, the penmanship, and even the tint of the ink. For what purpose, do you ask? For no purpose, except that I hoped in some mysterious manner to obtain more light on the subject. No light came, however. The more I scrutinised and pondered, the greater was my mystification. The paper was a simple sheet of white letter paper, of the kind ordinarily used by my uncle in his correspondence. So far as I could see, there was nothing peculiar about the ink. Any one familiar with my uncle's writing could have sworn that no hand but his had penned the lines. His well-known signature, a masterpiece of involved hieroglyphics, was there in all its indistinctness, written as no one but himself could ever have written it. And yet, for some unaccountable reason, I was half disposed to suspect forgery. Forgery! What nonsense! Any one clever enough to imitate Richard Yardington's handwriting would have employed his talents more profitably than indulging in a mischievous and purposeless jest. Not a bank in Toronto but would have discounted a note with that signature affixed to it. Desisting from all attempts to solve these problems, I then tried to fathom the meaning of other points in the letter. What misfortune had happened to mar the Christmas festivities at my uncle's house? And what could the reference to my cousin Alice's sorrows mean? She was not ill. That, I thought, might be taken for granted. My uncle would hardly have referred to her illness as one of the sorrows she had to endure lately. Certainly illness may be regarded in the light of a sorrow, but sorrow was not precisely the word which a straightforward man like Uncle Richard would have applied to it. I could conceive of no other cause of affliction in her case. My uncle was well, as was evinced by his having written the letter, and by his avowed intention to meet me at the station. Her father had died long before I started for Australia. She had no other near relation except myself, and she had no cause for anxiety, much less for sorrow, on my account. I thought it singular, too, that my uncle, having in some strange manner become acquainted with my movements, had withheld the knowledge from Alice. It did not square with my preconceived ideas of him that he would derive any satisfaction from taking his niece by surprise. All was a muddle together, and as my temples throbbed with the intensity of my thoughts, I was half disposed to believe myself in a troubled dream from which I should presently awake. Meanwhile on glided the train. A heavy snowstorm delayed us for several hours, and we reached Hamilton too late for the midday express for Toronto. We got there, however, in time for the accommodation leaving at 3:15 p.m., and we would reach Toronto at 5:05. I walked from one end of the train to the other in hopes of finding some one I knew, from whom I could make enquiries about home. Not a soul. I saw several persons whom I knew to be residents of Toronto, but none with whom I had ever been personally acquainted, and none of them would be likely to know anything about my uncle's domestic arrangements. All that remained to be done under these circumstances was to restrain my curiosity as well as I could until reaching Toronto. By the by, would my uncle really meet me at the station, according to his promise? Surely not. By what means could he possibly know that I would arrive by this train? Still, he seemed to have such accurate information respecting my proceedings that there was no saying where his knowledge began or ended. I tried not to think about the matter, but as the train approached Toronto my impatience became positively feverish in its intensity. We were not more than 3 minutes behind time as we glided in front of the Union Station. I passed out onto the platform of the car and peered intently through the darkness. Suddenly my heart gave a great bound. There, sure enough, standing in front of the door of the waiting room, was my uncle, plainly discernible by the fitful glare of the overhanging lamps. Before the train came to a standstill, I sprang from the car and advanced towards him. He was looking out for me, but his eyes not being as young as mine, he did not recognise me until I grasped him by the hand. He greeted me warmly, seizing me by the waist, and almost raising me from the ground. I at once noticed several changes in his appearance, changes for which I was wholly unprepared. He had aged very much since I had last seen him, and the lines about his mouth had deepened considerably. The iron grey hair which I remembered so well had disappeared, its place being supplied with a new and rather dandified looking wig. The old fashioned greatcoat which he had worn ever since I could remember had been supplanted by a modern frock of spruce cut, with sealskin collar and cuffs. All this I noticed in the first hurried greetings that passed between us. "Never mind your luggage, my boy," he remarked. "Leave it till to-morrow, when we will send down for it. If you are not tired, we'll walk home instead of taking a cab. I have a good deal to say to you before we get there." I had not slept since leaving Boston, but was too much excited to be conscious of fatigue, and, as will readily be believed, I was anxious enough to hear what he had to say. We passed from the station and proceeded up York Street, arm in arm. "And now, Uncle Richard," I said, as soon as we were well clear of the crowd, "keep me no longer in suspense. First and foremost, is Alice well?" "Quite well, but for reasons you will soon understand, she is in deep grief. You must know that—" "But," I interrupted, "tell me, in the name of all that's wonderful, how you knew I was coming by this train, and how did you come to write me at Boston?" Just then we came to the corner of Front Street, where was a lamp post. As we reached the spot where the light of the lamp was most brilliant, he turned half round, looked me full in the face, and smiled a sort of wintry smile. The expression of his countenance was almost ghastly. "Uncle," I quickly said, "what's the matter? Are you not well?" "I am not as strong as I used to be, and I have had a good deal to try me of late. Have patience, and I will tell you all. Let us walk more slowly, or I shall not finish before we get home. In order that you may clearly understand how matters are, I had better begin at the beginning, and I hope you will not interrupt me with any questions till I have done. How I knew you would call at the Boston post office, and that you would arrive in Toronto by this train, will come last in order. By the by, have you my letter with you?" "The one you wrote to me at Boston? Yes, here it is," I replied, taking it from my pocket book. "Let me have it." I handed it to him, and he put it into the breast pocket of his inside coat. I wondered at this proceeding on his part, but made no remark upon it. We moderated our pace, and he began his narration. Of course, I don't pretend to remember his exact words, but they were to this effect. During the winter following my departure to Melbourne, he had formed the acquaintance of a gentleman who had then recently settled in Toronto. The name of this gentleman was Marcus Weatherley, who had commenced business as a wholesale provision merchant immediately upon his arrival, and had been engaged in it ever since. For more than 3 years the acquaintance between him and my uncle had been very slight, but during the last summer they had had some real estate transactions together, and had become intimate. Weatherley, who was comparatively a young man and unmarried, had been invited to the house on Gerrard Street, where he had more recently become a pretty frequent visitor. More recently still, his visits had become so frequent that my uncle suspected him of a desire to be attentive to my cousin, and had thought proper to enlighten him as to her engagement with me. From that day his visits had been voluntarily discontinued. My uncle had not given much consideration to the subject until a fortnight afterwards, when he had accidentally become aware of the fact that Weatherley was in embarrassed circumstances. Here my uncle paused in his narrative to take a breath. He then added, in a low tone, and putting his mouth almost close to my ear, "And, Willie, my boy, I have at last found out something else. He has $42,000 falling due here and in Montreal within the next 10 days, and he has forged my signature to acceptances for $39,716.24. Those, to the best of my belief, were his exact words. We had walked up York Street to Queen, and then had gone down Queen to Yonge, when we turned up the east side on our way homeward. At the moment when the last words were uttered, we had got a few yards north of Crookshank Street, immediately in front of a chemist's shop, which was, I think, the third house from the corner. The window of the shop was well lighted, and its brightness was reflected on the sidewalk in front. Just then, 2 gentlemen walking rapidly in the opposite direction to that we were taking brushed by us, but I was too deeply absorbed in my uncle's communication to pay much attention to passers by. Scarcely had they passed, however, ere one of them stopped and exclaimed, "Surely that is Willie Furlong!" I turned and recognised Johnny Gray, one of my oldest friends. I relinquished my uncle's arm for a moment, and shook hands with Gray, who said, "I am surprised to see you. I had heard only a few days ago that you were not to be here till next spring." "I am here," I remarked, somewhat in advance of my own expectations. I then hurriedly inquired after several of our common friends, to which inquiries he briefly replied. "All well," he said, "but you are in a hurry, and so am I. Don't let me detain you. Be sure and look in on me to-morrow. You will find me at the old place in the Romaine Buildings." We again shook hands, and he passed on down the street with the gentleman who accompanied him. I then turned to repossess myself of my uncle's arm. The old gentleman had evidently walked on, for he was not in sight. I hurried along, making sure of overtaking him before reaching Gould Street, for my interview with Gray had occupied barely a minute. In another minute I was at the corner of Gould Street. No signs of Uncle Richard. I quickened my pace to a run, which soon brought me to Gerrard Street. Still no signs of my uncle. I had certainly not passed him on my way, and he could not have got farther on his homeward route than here. He must have called in at one of the stores, a strange thing for him to do under the circumstances. I retraced my steps all the way to the front of the chemist's shop, peering into every window and doorway as I passed along. No one in the least resembling him was to be seen. I stood still for a moment, and reflected. Even if he had run at full speed, a thing most unseemly for him to do, he could not have reached the corner of Gerrard Street before I had done so. And what should he run for? He certainly did not wish to avoid me, for he had more to tell me before reaching home. Perhaps he had turned down Gould Street. At any rate, there was no use waiting for him. I might as well go home at once. And I did. Upon reaching the old familiar spot, I opened the gate, passed on up the steps to the front door, and rang the bell. The door was opened by a domestic who had not formed part of the establishment in my time, and who did not know me, but Alice happened to be passing through the hall, and heard my voice as I inquired for Uncle Richard. Another moment and she was in my arms. With a strange foreboding at my heart, I noticed that she was in deep mourning. We passed into the dining room, where the table was laid for dinner. "Has Uncle Richard come in?" I asked, as soon as we were alone. "Why did he run away from me?" "Who?" exclaimed Alice with a start. "What do you mean, Willie? Is it possible you have not heard?" "Heard what?" "I see you have not heard," she replied. "Sit down, Willie, and prepare yourself for painful news. But first tell me what you meant by saying what you did just now. Who was it that ran away from you?" "Well, perhaps I should hardly call it running away, but he certainly disappeared most mysteriously, down here near the corner of Yonge and Crookshank Streets." "Of whom are you speaking?" "Of Uncle Richard, of course." "Uncle Richard! The corner of Yonge and Crookshank Streets! When did you see him there?" "When? A quarter of an hour ago. He met me at the station, and we walked up together till I met Johnny Gray. I turned to speak to Johnny for a moment, when—" "Willie! What on earth are you talking about? You are labouring under some strange delusion. Uncle Richard died of apoplexy more than 6 weeks ago, and lies buried in St. James's Cemetery." End of Part 1. The Gerrard Street Mystery. Read by Moira Fogarty in Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Moira Fogarty. The Gerrard Street Mystery by John Charles Dent. Part 2. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to think, with my face buried in my hands. My mind had been kept on a strain during the last 30 hours, and the succession of surprises to which I had been subjected had temporarily paralysed my faculties. For a few moments after Alice's announcement I must have been in a sort of stupor. My imagination, I remember, ran riot about everything in general, and nothing in particular. My cousin's momentary impression was that I had met with an accident of some kind, which had unhinged my brain. The first distinct remembrance I have after this is, that I suddenly awoke from my stupor to find Alice kneeling at my feet and holding me by the hand. Then my mental powers came back to me, and I recalled all the incidents of the evening. "When did uncle's death take place?" I asked. "On the 3rd of November, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was quite unexpected, though he had not enjoyed his usual health for some weeks before. He fell down in the hall just as he was returning from a walk, and died within 2 hours. He never spoke or recognised any one after his seizure." "What has become of his old overcoat?" I asked. "His old overcoat, Willie! What a question!" replied Alice, evidently thinking that I was again drifting back into insensibility. "Did he continue to wear it up to the day of his death?" I asked. "No. Cold weather set in very early this last fall, and he was compelled to don his winter clothing earlier than usual. He had a new overcoat made within a fortnight before he died. He had it on at the time of his seizure. But why do you ask? Was the new coat cut by a fashionable tailor, and had it a fur collar and cuffs? It was cut at Stovall's, I think. It had a fur collar and cuffs." "When did he begin to wear a wig?" "About the same time that he began to wear his new overcoat. I wrote you a letter at the time, making merry over his youthful appearance, and hinting, of course only in jest, that he was looking out for a young wife. But you surely did not receive my letter. You must have been on your way home before it was written." "I left Melbourne on the 11th of October. The wig, I suppose, was buried with him?" "Yes." "And where is the overcoat?" "In the wardrobe upstairs, in uncle's room." "Come and show it to me." I led the way upstairs, my cousin following. In the hall of the first floor we encountered my old friend Mrs. Daly, the housekeeper. She threw up her hands in surprise at seeing me. Our greeting was very brief. I was too intent on solving the problem, which had exercised my mind ever since receiving the letter at Boston, to pay much attention to anything else. 2 words, however, explained to her where we were going, and at our request she accompanied us. We passed into my uncle's room. My cousin drew the key of the wardrobe from a drawer where it was kept, and unlocked the door. There hung the overcoat. A single glance was sufficient. It was the same. The dazed sensation in my head began to make itself felt again. The atmosphere of the room seemed to oppress me, and closing the door of the wardrobe, I led the way downstairs again to the dining room, followed by my cousin. Mrs. Daly had sense enough to perceive that we were discussing family matters, and retired to her own room. I took my cousin's hand in mine, and asked, "Will you tell me what you know of Mr. Marcus Weatherley?" This was evidently another surprise for her. How could I have heard of Marcus Weatherley? She answered, however, without hesitation, "I know very little of him. Uncle Richard and he had some dealings a few months since, and in that way he became a visitor here. After a while he began to call pretty often, but his visit suddenly ceased a short time before uncle's death. I need not affect any reserve with you. Uncle Richard thought he came after me, and gave him a hint that you had a prior claim. He never called afterwards. I am rather glad that he didn't, for there is something about him that I don't quite like. I am at a loss to say what the something is, but his manner always impressed me with the idea that he was not exactly what he seemed to be on the surface. Perhaps I misjudged him. Indeed, I think I must have done so, for he stands well with everybody, and is highly respected." I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 10 minutes to 7. I rose from my seat. "I will ask you to excuse me for an hour or two, Alice. I must find Johnny Gray." "But you will not leave me, Willie, until you have given me some clue to your unexpected arrival, and to the strange questions you have been asking. Dinner is ready, and can be served at once. Pray don't go out again till you have dined." She clung to my arm. It was evident that she considered me mad, and thought it probable that I might make away with myself. This I could not bear. As for eating any dinner, that was simply impossible in my then frame of mind, although I had not tasted food since leaving Rochester. I resolved to tell her all. I resumed my seat. She placed herself on a stool at my feet, and listened while I told her all that I have set down as happening to me subsequently to my last letter to her from Melbourne. "And now, Alice, you know why I wished to see Johnny Gray." She would have accompanied me, but I thought it better to prosecute my inquiries alone. I promised to return some time during the night, and tell her the result of my interview with Gray. That gentleman had married and become a householder on his own account during my absence in Australia. Alice knew his address, and gave me the number of his house, which was on Church Street. A few minutes' rapid walking brought me to his door. I had no great expectation of finding him at home, as I deemed it probable he had not returned from wherever he had been going when I met him; but I should be able to find out when he was expected, and would either wait or go in search of him. Fortune favoured me for once, however. He had returned more than an hour before. I was ushered into the drawing room, where I found him playing cribbage with his wife. "Why, Willie!" he exclaimed, advancing to welcome me. "This is kinder than I expected. I hardly looked for you before to-morrow. All the better, we have just been speaking of you. Ellen, this is my old friend Willie Furlong, the returned convict, whose banishment you have so often heard me deplore." After exchanging brief courtesies with Mrs. Gray, I turned to her husband. "Johnny, did you notice anything remarkable about the old gentleman who was with me when we met on Yonge Street this evening?" "Old gentleman? Who? There was no one with you when I met you." "Think again. He and I were walking arm in arm, and you had passed us before you recognised me and mentioned my name." He looked hard in my face for a moment, and then said positively, "You are wrong, Willie. You were certainly alone when we met. You were walking slowly, and I must have noticed if any one had been with you." "It is you who are wrong," I retorted, almost sternly. "I was accompanied by an elderly gentleman, who wore a great coat with fur collar and cuffs, and we were conversing earnestly together when you passed us." He hesitated an instant, and seemed to consider, but there was no shade of doubt on his face. "Have it your own way, old boy," he said. "All I can say is, that I saw no one but yourself, and neither did Charlie Leach, who was with me. After parting from you, we commented upon your evident abstraction, and the sombre expression of your countenance, which we attributed to your having only recently heard of the sudden death of your Uncle Richard. If any old gentleman had been with you, we could not possibly have failed to notice him." Without a single word by way of explanation or apology, I jumped from my seat, passed out into the hall, seized my hat, and left the house. End of Part 2. The Gerrard Street Mystery. Read by Moira Fogarty, October 2006. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Moira Fogarty. The Gerrard Street Mystery by John Charles Dent. Part 3. Out into the street I rushed like a madman, banging the door after me. I knew that Johnny would follow me for an explanation, so I ran like lightning round the next corner, and thence down to Yonge Street. Then I dropped into a walk, regained my breath, and asked myself what I should do next. Suddenly I bethought me of Dr. Marsden, an old friend of my uncle's. I hailed a passing cab, and drove to his house. The doctor was in his consultation room, and alone. Of course he was surprised to see me, and gave expression to some appropriate words of sympathy at my bereavement. "But how is it that I see you so soon?" he asked. "I understood that you were not expected for some months to come." Then I began my story, which I related with great circumstantiality of detail, bringing it down to the moment of my arrival at his house. He listened with the closest attention, never interrupting me by a single exclamation until I had finished. Then he began to ask questions, some of which I thought strangely irrelevant. "Have you enjoyed your usual good health during your residence abroad?" "Never better in my life. I have not had a moment's illness since you last saw me." "And how have you prospered in your business enterprises?" "Reasonably well. But pray, doctor, let us confine ourselves to the matter in hand. I have come for friendly, not professional advice." "All in good time, my boy," he calmly remarked. This was tantalizing. My strange narrative did not seem to have disturbed his serenity in the least degree. "Did you have a pleasant passage?" he asked, after a brief pause. "The ocean, I believe, is generally rough at this time of year." "I felt a little squeamish for a day or two after leaving Melbourne," I replied, "but I soon got over it, and it was not very bad even while it lasted. I am a tolerably good sailor." "And you have had no special ground of anxiety of late, at least not until you received this wonderful letter," he added, with a perceptible contraction of his lips, as though trying to repress a smile. Then I saw what he was driving at. "Doctor!" I exclaimed, with some exasperation in my tone, "pray dismiss from your mind the idea that what I have told you is the result of a diseased imagination. I am as sane as you are. The letter itself affords sufficient evidence that I am not quite such a fool as you take me for." "My dear boy, I don't take you for a fool at all, although you are a little excited just at present. But I thought you said you returned the letter to your uncle?" For a moment I had forgotten that important fact, but I was not altogether without evidence that I had not been the victim of a disordered brain. My friend Gridley could corroborate the receipt of the letter and its contents. My cousin could bear witness that I had displayed an acquaintance with facts which I would not have been likely to learn from any one but my uncle. I had referred to his wig and overcoat, and had mentioned to her the name of Mr. Marcus Weatherley, a name which I had never heard before in my life. I called Dr. Marsden's attention to these matters, and asked him to explain them if he could. "I admit," said the doctor, "that I don't quite see my way to a satisfactory explanation just at present. But let us look the matter squarely in the face. During an acquaintance of nearly 30 years, I always found your uncle a truthful man, who was cautious enough to make no statements about his neighbours that he was not able to prove. Your informant, on the other hand, does not seem to have confined himself to facts. He made a charge of forgery against a gentleman whose moral and commercial integrity are unquestioned by all who know him. I know Marcus Weatherley pretty well, and am not disposed to pronounce him a forger and a scoundrel upon the unsupported evidence of a shadowy old gentleman who appears and disappears in the most mysterious manner, and who cannot be laid hold of and held responsible for his slanders in a court of law. And it is not true, as far as I know and believe, that Marcus Weatherley is embarrassed in his circumstances. Such confidence have I in his solvency and integrity, that I would not be afraid to take up all his outstanding paper without asking a question. If you will make inquiry, you will find that my opinion is shared by all the bankers in the city, and I have no hesitation in saying that you will find no acceptances with your uncle's name to them either, in this market or elsewhere." "That I will try to ascertain to-morrow," I replied. "Meanwhile, Dr. Marsden, will you oblige your old friend's nephew by writing to Mr. Junius Gridley, and asking him to acquaint you with the contents of the letter, and the circumstances under which I received it?" "It seems an absurd thing to do," he said, "but I will if you like. What shall I say?" And he sat down at his desk to write the letter. It was written in less than 5 minutes. It simply asked for the desired information, and requested an immediate reply. Below the doctor's signature I added a short postscript in these words: "My story about the letter and its contents is discredited. Pray answer fully and at once. W.F.F." At my request the doctor accompanied me to the post office on Toronto Street, and dropped the letter into the box with his own hands. I bade him good night, and repaired to the Rawson House. I did not feel like encountering Alice again until I could place myself in a more satisfactory light before her. I dispatched a messenger to her with a short note, stating that I had not discovered anything important, and requesting her not to wait up for me. Then I engaged a room and went to bed. But not to sleep. All night long I tossed about from one side of the bed to the other, and at daylight, feverish and unrefreshed, I strolled out. I returned in time for breakfast, but ate little or nothing. I longed for the arrival of 10 o'clock, when the banks would open. After breakfast I sat down in the reading room of the hotel, and vainly tried to fix my attention upon the local columns of the morning's paper. I remember reading over several items time after time, without any comprehension of their meaning. After that I remember nothing. Nothing? All was blank for more than 5 weeks. When consciousness came back to me, I found myself in bed in my own old room, in the house on Gerrard Street, and Alice and Dr. Marsden were standing by my bedside. No need to tell how my hair had been removed, nor about the bags of ice that had been applied to my head. No need to linger over any details of the pitiless fever that burned in my brain. No need either to linger over my progress back to convalescence, and thence to complete recovery. In a week from the time I have mentioned, I was permitted to sit up in bed, propped up by a mountain of pillows. My impatience would brook no further delay, and I was allowed to ask questions about what had happened in the interval which had elapsed since my overwrought nerves gave way under the prolonged strain upon them. First, Junius Gridley's letter in reply to Dr. Marsden was placed in my hands. I have it still in my possession, and I transcribe the following copy from the original now lying before me. Boston, December 22nd, 1861. Dr. Marsden, in reply to your letter, which has just been received, I have to say that Mr. Furlong and myself became acquainted for the first time during our recent passage from Liverpool to Boston, in the Persia, which arrived here Monday last. Mr. Furlong accompanied me home, and remained until Tuesday morning, when I took him to see the Public Library, the State House, the Athenaeum, Faneuil Hall, and other points of interest. We casually dropped into the post office, and he remarked upon the great number of letters there. At my instigation, made, of course, in jest, he applied at the general delivery for letters for himself. He received one bearing the Toronto postmark. He was naturally very much surprised at receiving it, and was not less so at its contents. After reading it, he handed it to me, and I also read it carefully. I cannot recollect it word for word, but it professed to come from his affectionate uncle, Richard Yardington. It expressed pleasure at his coming home sooner than had been anticipated, and hinted in rather vague terms at some calamity. He referred to a lady called Alice, and stated that she had not been informed of Mr. Furlong's intended arrival. There was something, too, about his presence at home being a recompense to her for recent grief which she had sustained. It also expressed the writer's intention to meet his nephew at the Toronto railway station upon his arrival, and stated that no telegram need be sent. This, as nearly as I can remember, was about all there was in the letter. Mr. Furlong professed to recognise the handwriting as his uncle's. It was a cramped hand, not easy to read, and the signature was so peculiarly formed that I was hardly able to decipher it. The peculiarity consisted of the extreme irregularity in the formation of the letters, no two of which were of equal size, and capitals were interspersed promiscuously, more especially throughout the surname. Mr. Furlong was much agitated by the contents of the letter, and was anxious for the arrival of the time of his departure. He left by the B&A train at 11:30. This is really all I know about the matter, and I have been anxiously expecting to hear from him ever since he left. I confess that I feel curious, and should be glad to hear from him. That is, of course, unless something is involved which it would be impertinent for a comparative stranger to pry into. Yours, etc., Junius H. Gridley. So that my friend has completely corroborated my account, so far as the letter was concerned. My account, however, stood in no need of corroboration, as will presently appear. When I was stricken down, Alice and Dr. Marsden were the only persons to whom I had communicated what my uncle had said to me during our walk from the station. They both maintained silence in the matter, except to each other. Between themselves, in the early days of my illness, they discussed it with a good deal of feeling on each side. Alice implicitly believed my story from first to last. She was wise enough to see that I had been made acquainted with matters that I could not possibly have learned through any ordinary channels of communication. In short, she was not so enamoured of professional jargon as to have lost her common sense. The doctor, however, with the mole blindness of many of his tribe, refused to believe. Nothing of this kind had previously come within the range of his own experience, and it was therefore impossible. He accounted for it all upon the hypothesis of my impending fever. He is not the only physician who mistakes cause for effects, and vice versa. During the second week of my prostration, Mr. Marcus Weatherley absconded. This event so totally unlooked for by those who had had dealings with him, at once brought his financial condition to light. It was found that he had been really insolvent for several months past. The day after his departure a number of his acceptances became due. These acceptances proved to be 4 in number, amounting to exactly $42,000. So that part of my uncle's story was confirmed. One of the acceptances was payable in Montreal, and was for $2,283.76. The other 3 were payable at different banks in Toronto. These last had been drawn at 60 days, and each of them bore a signature presumed to be that of Richard Yardington. One of them was for $8,972.11. Another was for $10,114.63, and the third and last was for $20,629.50. A short sum in simple addition will show us the aggregate of these 3 amounts: $39,716.24, which was the amount for which my uncle claimed that his name had been forged. Within a week after these things came to light, a letter addressed to the manager of one of the leading banking institutions of Toronto arrived from Mr. Marcus Weatherly. He wrote from New York, but stated that he should leave there within an hour from the time of posting his letter. He voluntarily admitted having forged the name of my uncle to the 3 acceptances above referred to, and entered into other details about his affairs, which, though interesting enough to his creditors at that time, would have no special interest to the public at the present day. The banks where the acceptances had been discounted were wise after the fact, and detected numerous little details wherein the forged signatures differed from the genuine signatures of my uncle Richard. In each case they pocketed the loss and held their tongues, and I dare say they will not thank me for calling attention to the matter, even at this distance of time. There is not much more to tell. Marcus Weatherly, the forger, met his fate within a few days after writing his letter from New York. He took passage at New Bedford, Massachusetts, in a sailing vessel called the Petrel, bound for Havana. The Petrel sailed from port on the 12th of January, 1862, and went down in mid-ocean with all hands on the 23rd of the same month. She sank in full sight of the captain and crew of the City of Baltimore, Inman line, but the hurricane prevailing was such that the latter were unable to render any assistance, or to save one of the ill-fated crew from the fury of the waves. At an early stage in the story I mentioned that the only fictitious element should be the name of one of the characters introduced. The name is that of Marcus Weatherly himself. The person whom I have so designated really bore a different name, one that is still remembered by scores of people in Toronto. He has paid the penalty of his misdeeds, and I see nothing to be gained by perpetuating them in connection with his own proper name. In all other particulars the foregoing narrative is as true as a tolerably retentive memory has enabled me to record it. I don't propose to attempt any psychological explanation of the events here recorded, for the very sufficient reason that only one explanation is possible. The weird letter and its contents, as has been seen, do not rest upon my testimony alone. With respect to my walk from the station with Uncle Richard, and the communication made by him to me, all the details are as real to my mind as any other incidents of my life. The only obvious deduction is, that I was made the recipient of a communication of the kind which the world is accustomed to regard as supernatural. Mr. Owen's publishers have my full permission to appropriate this story in the next edition of his Debatable Land Between This World and the Next. Should they do so, their readers will doubtless be favoured with an elaborate analysis of the facts, and with a pseudo-philosophic theory about spiritual communion with human beings. My wife, who is an enthusiastic student of electrobiology, is disposed to believe that Weatherly's mind, overweighted by the knowledge of his forgery, was in some occult manner, and unconsciously to himself, constrained to act upon my own senses. I prefer, however, simply to narrate the facts. I may or may not have my own theory about those facts. The reader is at perfect liberty to form one of his own if he so pleases. I may mention that Dr. Marsden professes to believe to the present day that my mind was disordered by the approach of the fever which eventually struck me down, and that all I have described was merely the result of what he, with delightful periphrasis, calls an abnormal condition of the system, induced by causes too remote for specific diagnosis. It will be observed that, whether I was under an hallucination or not, the information supposed to be derived from my uncle was strictly accurate in all its details. The fact that the disclosure subsequently became unnecessary through the confession of Weatherley does not seem to me to afford any argument for the hallucination theory. My uncle's communication was important at the time when it was given to me, and we have no reason for believing that those who are gone before are universally gifted with the knowledge of the future. It was open to me to make the facts public as soon as they became known to me, and had I done so, Marcus Weatherley might have been arrested and punished for his crime. Had not my illness supervened, I think I should have made discoveries in the course of the day following my arrival in Toronto which would have led to his arrest. Such speculations are profitless enough, but they have often formed the topic of discussion between my wife and myself. Gridley, too, whenever he pays us a visit, invariably revives the subject, which he long ago christened the Gerrard Street Mystery, although it might just as correctly be called the Yonge Street Mystery, or the Mystery of the Union Station. He has urged me 100 times over to publish the story, and now, after all these years, I follow his counsel and adopt his nomenclature in the title. End of the Gerrard Street Mystery, Part 3. End of story. Read by Moira Fogarty in Toronto, Ontario, October 2006.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Gagtooth's Image. Chapter 4. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, the 4th of September, 1884, I was riding up Yonge Street in the city of Toronto on the top of a crowded omnibus. The omnibus was bound for Thornhill, and my own destination was the intermediate village of Willowdale. Having been in Canada only a short time, and being almost a stranger in Toronto, I dare say I was looking around me with more attention and curiosity than persons who are native here and to the manner born are accustomed to exhibit. We had just passed Isabella Street and were rapidly nearing Charles Street when I noticed on my right hand a large, dilapidated frame building standing in solitary isolation a few feet back from the highway, and presenting the appearance of a veritable old curiosity shop. A business was carried on here in second-hand furniture of the poorest description, and the object of the proprietor seemed to have been to collect about him all sorts of worn-out commodities and objects which were utterly unmarketable. Everybody who lived in Toronto at the time indicated will remember the establishment, which, as I subsequently learned, was owned and carried on by a man named Robert Southworth, familiarly known to his customers as Old Bob. I had no sooner arrived abreast of the gateway leading into the yard, immediately adjoining the building to the southward, than my eyes rested upon something which instantly caused them to open themselves to their very widest capacity, and constrained me to signal the driver to stop, which he had no sooner done than I alighted from my seat and requested him to proceed on his journey without me. The driver eyed me suspiciously, and evidently regarded me as an odd customer, but he obeyed my request and drove on northward, leaving me standing in the middle of the street. From my elevated seat on the roof of the bus I had caught a hurried glimpse of a commonplace-looking little marble figure placed on the top of a pedestal in the yard already referred to, where several other figures in marble, wood, bronze, stucco, and what not were exposed for sale. The particular figure which had attracted my attention was about 15 inches in height, and represented a little child in the attitude of prayer. Anyone seeing it for the first time would probably have taken it for a representation of the infant Samuel. I have called it commonplace, and considered as a work of art, which it undoubtedly was, it must have possessed a certain distinctive individuality, for the brief glance which I had caught of it, even at that distance, had been sufficient to convince me that the figure was an old acquaintance of mine. It was in consequence of that conviction that I had dismounted from the omnibus, forgetful for the moment of everything but the matter which was uppermost in my mind. I lost no time in passing through the gateway leading into the yard, and in walking up to the pedestal upon which the little figure was placed. Taking the ladder in my hand, I found, as I had expected, that it was not attached to the pedestal, which was of totally different material and much more elaborate workmanship. Turning the figure upside down, my eyes rested on these words, deeply cut into the little circular throne upon which the figure rested: Jackson, Peoria, 1854. At this juncture the proprietor of the establishment walked up to where I was standing beside the pedestal. "Like to look at something in that way, sir?" he asked. "We have more inside." "What is the price of this?" I asked, indicating the figure in my hand. "That, sir, you may have that for 50 cents. Of course, without the pedestal, which don't belong to it." "Have you had it on hand long?" "I don't know, but if you'll step inside for a moment, I can tell you. This way, sir." Taking the figure under my arm, I followed him into what he called the office, a small and dirty room, crowded with old furniture in the last stage of dilapidation. From a desk in one corner he took up a large tome, labelled Stockbook, to which he referred, after glancing at a hieroglyphical device pasted on the figure which I held under my arm. "Yes, sir. Had that ever since the 14th of March, 1880. Bought it at Morris and Blackwell's sale, sir." "Who and what are Messrs. Morris and Blackwell?" I inquired. "They were auctioneers down on Adelaide Street in the city, sir. Failed some time last winter. Mr. Morris has since died, and I believe Blackwell, the other partner, went to the States." After a few more questions, finding that he knew nothing whatever about the matter beyond what he had already told me, I paid over the 50 cents, and declining with thanks his offer to send my purchase home to me, I marched off with it down the street, and made the best of my way back to the Rawson house, where I had been staying for some days before. From what has been said, it will be inferred that I, a stranger in Canada, must have had some special reason for encumbering myself in my travels with an intrinsically worthless piece of common Columbia marble. I had a reason. I had often seen that little figure before, and the last time I had seen it, previous to the occasion above mentioned, had been in the town of Peoria, in the state of Illinois, sometime in the month of June, 1855. There is a story connected with that little praying figure, a story which, to me, is a very touching one, and I believe myself to be the only human being capable of telling it. Indeed, I am only able to tell a part of it, how the figure came to be sold at auction in the city of Toronto at Messrs. Morris and Blackwell's sale on the 14th of March, 1880, or how it ever came to be in this part of the world at all, I know no more than the reader does. But I can probably tell all that is worth knowing about the matter. In the year 1850, and for I know not how long previously, there lived at Peoria, Illinois, a journeyman blacksmith named Abner Fink. I mention the date 1850 because it was in that year that I myself settled in Peoria, and first had any knowledge of him, but I believe he had been living there for some length of time. He was employed at the foundry of Messrs. Gowanlock and Van Duzer, and was known for an excellent workman, of steady habits and good moral character, qualifications which were by no means universal, nor even common among persons of his calling and degree in life, at the time and place of which I am writing. But he was still more conspicuous on the lucus a non lucendu principle for another quality, that of reticence. It was very rarely indeed that he spoke to anyone, except when called upon to reply to a question, and even then it was noticeable that he invariably employed the fewest and most concise words in his vocabulary. If brevity were the body as well as the soul of wit, Fink must have been about the wittiest man that ever lived, the monosyllabic traveller not excepted. He never received a letter from anyone during the whole time of his stay at Peoria, nor, so far as was known, did he ever write to anyone. Indeed, there was no evidence that he was able to write. He never went to church, nor even to meeting, never attended any public entertainment, never took any holidays. All his time was spent either at the foundry where he worked or at the boarding house where he lodged. In the latter place, the greater part of his hours of relaxation were spent in looking either out of the window or into the fire, thinking apparently about nothing particular. All endeavours on the part of his fellow boarders to draw him into conversation were utterly fruitless. No one in the place knew anything about his past life, and when his fellow journeymen in the workshop attempted to inveigle him into any confidence on that subject, he had a trick of calling up a harsh and sinister expression of countenance, which effectively nipped all such experiments in the bud. Even his employers failed to elicit anything from him on this head, beyond the somewhat vague piece of intelligence that he hailed from down east. The foreman of the establishment, with a desperate attempt at facetiousness, used to say of him that no one knew who he was, where he came from, where he was going to, or what he was going to do when he got there. And yet this utter lack of sociability could scarcely have arisen from positive surliness or unkindness of disposition. Instances were not wanting in which he had given pretty strong evidence that he carried beneath that rugged and uncouth exterior a kinder and more gentle heart than is possessed by most men. Upon one occasion he jumped, at the imminent peril of his life, from the bridge which spans the Illinois River, just above the entrance to the lake, and had fished up a drowning child from its depths and borne it to the shore in safety. In doing so he had been compelled to swim through a swift and strong current, which would have swamped any swimmer with one particle less strength, endurance, and pluck. At another time, hearing his landlady say at dinner that an execution was in the house of a sick man with a large family at the other end of town, he left his dinner untouched, trudged off to the place indicated, and though the debtor was an utter stranger to him, paid off the debt and costs in full, without taking any assignment of the judgment or other security. Then he went quietly back to his work. From my knowledge of the worthless and impecunious character of the debtor, I am of opinion that Fink never received a cent in the way of reimbursement. In personal appearance he was short and stout. His age, when I first knew him, must have been somewhere in the neighbourhood of 35. The only peculiarity about his face was an abnormal formation of one of his front teeth, which protruded and stuck out almost horizontally. This, as may be supposed, did not tend to improve an expression of countenance which in other respects was not very prepossessing. One of the anvil strikers happening to allude to him one day, in his absence, by the name of Gagtooth, the felicity of the sobriquet at once commended itself to the good taste of the other hands in the shop, who thereafter commonly spoke of him by that name, and eventually it came to be applied to him by every one in the town. My acquaintance with him began when I had been in Peoria about a week. I may premise that I am a physician and surgeon, a graduate of Harvard. Peoria was at that time a comparatively new place, but it gave promise of going ahead rapidly, a promise, by the way, which it has since amply redeemed. Messrs. Gowanlock and Van Duzer's foundry was a pretty extensive one for a small town in a comparatively new district. They kept about 150 hands employed all the year round, and during the busy season this number was more than doubled. It was in consequence of my having received the appointment of medical attendant to that establishment that I buried myself in the West instead of settling down in my native state of Massachusetts. Poor Gagtooth was one of my first surgical patients. It came about in this wise. At the foundry, 2 days a week, with Delicat, Tuesdays and Fridays, were chiefly devoted to what is called casting. On these days it was necessary to convey large masses of melted iron in vessels specially manufactured for that purpose, from one end of the moulding shop to the other. It was of course very desirable that the metal should not be allowed to cool while in transit, and that as little time as possible should be lost in transferring it from the furnace to the moulds. For this purpose Gagtooth's services were frequently called into requisition, as he was by far the strongest man in the place, and could without assistance carry one end of the vessels, which was considered pretty good work for two ordinary men. Well, one unlucky Friday afternoon he was hard at work at this employment, and as was usual with all the hands in the moulding shop at such times, he was stripped naked from the waist upwards. He was gallantly supporting one end of the large receptacles already mentioned, which happened to be rather fuller than usual of the red-hot molten metal. He had nearly reached the moulding box into which the contents of the vessel were to be poured, when he stumbled against a piece of scantling which was lying in his way. He fell, and as a necessary consequence his end of the vessel fell likewise, spilling the contents all over his body, which was literally deluged by the red, hissing, boiling liquid fire. It must have seemed to the terror-stricken onlookers like a bath of blood. Further details of the frightful accident and of my treatment of the case might be interesting to such of the readers of this book as happen to belong to my own profession, but to general readers such details would be simply shocking. How even his tremendous vitality and vigor of constitution brought him through it all is a mystery to me to this day. I am 36 years older than I was at the time. Since then I have acted as surgeon to a fighting regiment all through the Great Rebellion. I have had patients of all sorts of temperaments and constitutions under my charge, but never have I been brought into contact with a case which seemed more hopeless in my eyes. He must surely have had more than one life in him. I have never had my hands on so magnificent a specimen of the human frame as his was, and better still, and this doubtless contributed materially to his recovery, I have never had a case under my management where the patient bore his sufferings with such uniform fortitude and endurance. Suffice it to say that he recovered, and that his face bore no traces of the frightful ordeal through which he had passed. I don't think he was ever quite the same man as before his accident. I think his nervous system received a shock which eventually tended to shorten his life, but he was still known as incomparably the strongest man in Peoria, and continued to perform the work of two men at the moulding shop on casting days. In every other respect he was apparently the same man, not a whit more disposed to be companionable than before his accident. I used frequently to meet him on the street as he was going to and fro between his boarding house and the workshop. He was always alone, and more than once I came to a full stop and inquired after his health, or anything else that seemed to afford a feasible topic for conversation. He was uniformly civil and even respectful, but confined his remarks to replying to my questions, which, as usual, was done in the fewest words. During the 12 months succeeding his recovery, so far as I am aware, nothing occurred worthy of being recorded in Gagtooth's annals. About the expiration of that time, however, his landlady, by his authority, at his request, and in his presence, made an announcement to the boarders assembled at the dinner table, which, I should think, must literally have taken away their breaths. Gagtooth was going to be married. I don't suppose it would have occasioned greater astonishment if it had been announced as an actual fact that the Illinois River had commenced to flow backwards. It was surprising, incredible, but, like many other surprising and incredible things, it was true. Gagtooth was really and truly about to marry. The object of his choice was his landlady's sister, by name Lucinda Bowlsby. How or when the wooing had been carried on, how the engagement had been led up to, and in what terms the all-important question had been propounded, I am not prepared to say. I need hardly observe that none of the boarders had entertained the faintest suspicion that anything of the kind was impending. The courtship, from first to last, must have been somewhat of a piece with that of the late Mr. Barkis, but alas, Gagtooth did not settle his affections so judiciously, nor did he draw such a prize in the matrimonial lottery as Barkis did. Two women more entirely dissimilar in every respect than Peggotty and Lucinda Bowlsby can hardly be imagined. Lucinda was 19 years of age. She was pretty, and, for a girl of her class and station in life, tolerably well educated, but she was, notwithstanding, a light, giddy creature, and, I fear, something worse at that time, At all events, she had a very questionable sort of reputation among the boarders in the house, and was regarded with suspicion by everyone who knew anything about her poor Gagtooth alone excepted. In due time the wedding took place. It was solemnized at the boarding house, and the bride and bridegroom, disdaining to defer to the common usage, spent their honeymoon in their own house. Gagtooth had rented and furnished a little frame dwelling on the outskirts of the town, on the bank of the river, and thither the couple retired as soon as the hymeneal knot was tied. Next morning the bridegroom made his appearance at his forge and went to work as usual, as though nothing had occurred to disturb the serenity of his life. Time passed by. Rumours now and then reached my ears to the effect that Mrs. Fink was not behaving herself very well, and that she was leading her husband rather a hard life of it. She had been seen driving out into the country with a young lawyer from Springfield, who occasionally came over to Peoria to attend the sittings of the district court. She moreover had the reputation of habitually indulging in the contents of the cup that cheers and likewise inebriates. However, in the regular course of things, I was called upon to assist at the first appearance upon life's stage of a little boy, upon whom his parents bestowed the name of Charlie. The night of Charlie's birth was the first time I had ever been in the house, and if I remember aright, it was the first time I had ever set eyes on Mrs. Fink since her marriage. I was not long in making up my mind about her, and I had ample opportunity for forming an opinion as to her character, for she was unable to leave her bed for more than a month, during which time I was in attendance upon her almost daily. I also attended little Charlie through measles, scarlet rash, whooping cough, and all his childish ailments, and in fact I was a pretty regular visitor at the house from the time of his birth until his father left the neighbourhood, as I shall presently have to relate. I believe Mrs. Fink to have been not merely a profligate woman, but a thoroughly bad and heartless one in every respect. She was perfectly indifferent to her husband, whom she shamefully neglected, and almost indifferent to her child. She seemed to care for nothing in the world but dress and strong waters, and to procure these there was no depth of degradation in which she would not stoop. As a result of my constant professional attendance upon his mother during the first month of little Charlie's life, I became better acquainted with his father than anyone in Peoria had ever done. He seemed to know that I saw into and sympathized with his domestic troubles, and my silent sympathy seemed to afford him some consolation. As the months and years passed by, his wife's conduct became worse and worse, and his affections centered themselves entirely upon his child, whom he loved with a passionate affection to which I have never seen a parallel. And Charlie was a child made to be loved. When he was 2 years old, he was beyond all comparison the dearest and most beautiful little fellow I have ever seen. His fat, plump, chubby little figure, modelled after Cupid's own, his curly flaxen hair, his matchless complexion, fair and clear as the sky on a sunny summer day, and his bright, round, expressive eyes, which imparted intelligence to his every feature, combined to make him the idol of his father, the envy of all the mothers in town, and the admiration of everyone who saw him. At noon, when the great foundry bell rang, which was to signal the workmen to go to dinner, Charlie might regularly be seen toddling as fast as his stout little legs could spin along the footpath leading over the common in the direction of the workshops. When about halfway across, he would be certain to meet his father, who, taking the child up in his bare, brawny, smoke-begrimed arms, would carry him home, the contrast between the two strongly suggesting Vulcan and Cupid. At 6 o'clock in the evening, when the bell announced that work was over for the day, a similar little drama was enacted. It would be difficult to say whether Vulcan or Cupid derived the greater amount of pleasure from these semi-daily incidents. After tea the two were never separate for a moment. While the mother was perhaps busily engaged in the perusal of some worthless novel, the father would sit with his darling on his knee, listening to his childish prattle, and perhaps so far going out of himself as to tell the child a little story. It seemed to be an understood thing that the mother should take no care or notice of the boy during her husband's presence in the house. Regularly, when the clock in the chimney piece struck 8, Charlie would jump down from his father's knee and run across the room for his night-dress, returning to his father to have it put on. When this had been done, he would kneel down and repeat a simple little prayer, in which one who loved little children like Charlie was invoked to bless his father and mother, and make him a good boy, after which his father would place him in his little crib, where he soon slept the sleep of happy childhood. My own house was not far from theirs, and I was so fond of Charlie that it was no uncommon thing for me to drop in upon them for a few minutes when returning from my office in the evening. Upon one occasion I noticed the child more particularly than usual while he was in the act of saying his prayers. His eyes were closed, his plump little hands were clasped, and his cherubic little face was turned upwards with an expression of infantile trustfulness and adoration which I shall never forget. I have never seen, nor do I ever expect to see, anything else half so beautiful. When he arose from his knees and came up to me to say good night, I kissed his upturned little face with even greater fervour than usual. After he had been put to bed, I mentioned the matter to his father, and said something about my regret that the child's expression had not been caught by a sculptor and fixed in stone. I had little idea of the effect my remarks were destined to produce. A few evenings afterwards he informed me, much to my surprise, that he had determined to act upon the idea which my words had suggested to his mind, and that he instructed Herbert Jackson, the marble cutter, to go to work at a stone likeness of little Charlie, and to finish it up as soon as possible. He did not seem to understand that the proper performance of such a task required anything more than mere mechanical skill, and that an ordinary tombstone cutter was scarcely the sort of artist to do justice to it. However, when the stone likeness was finished and sent home, I confess I was astonished to see how well Jackson had succeeded. He had not, of course, caught the child's exact expression. It is probable, indeed, that he never saw the expression on Charlie's face, which had seemed so beautiful to me, and which had suggested to me the idea of its being embodied in marble, as the professionals call it. But the image was, at all events, according to order, a likeness. The true lineaments were there, and I would have recognized it for a representation of my little friend at the first glance, wherever I might have seen it. In short, it was precisely one of those works of art which have no artistic value whatever for any one who is unacquainted with or uninterested in the subject represented, but knowing and loving little Charlie as I did, I confess that I used to contemplate Jackson's piece of workmanship with an admiration and enthusiasm which the contents of Italian galleries have failed to arouse in me. Well, the months flew by until some time in the spring of 1855, when the town was electrified by the sudden and totally unexpected failure of Messrs. Gowanlock and Van Duzer, who up to that time were currently reported to be one of the wealthiest and most thriving firms in the state. Their failure was not only a great misfortune for the workmen, who were thus thrown out of present employment, for the creditors did not carry on the business, but was regarded as a public calamity to the town and neighbourhood, the prosperity whereof had been enhanced in no inconsiderable degree by the carrying on of so an extensive establishment in their midst, and by the enterprise and energy of the proprietors, both of whom were first-rate businessmen. The failure was in no measure attributed either to dishonesty or want of prudence on the part of Messrs. Gowanlock and Van Duzer, but simply to the invention of a new patent which rendered valueless the particular agricultural implement which constituted the specialty of the establishment, and of which there was an enormous stock on hand. There was not the shadow of a hope of the firm being able to get upon its legs again. The partners surrendered everything almost to the last dollar, and shortly afterwards left Illinois for California. Now, this failure, which more or less affected the entire population of Peoria, was especially disastrous to poor Fink. For past years he had been saving money, and as Messrs. Gowanlock and Van Duzer allowed interest at a liberal rate upon all deposits left in their hands by their workmen, all his surplus earnings remained untouched. The consequence was that the accumulations of years were swamped at one fell swoop, and he found himself reduced to poverty. And as though misfortune was not satisfied with visiting him thus heavily, the very day of the failure he was stricken down by typhoid fever. Not the typhoid fever known in Canada, which is bad enough, but the terrible putrid typhoid of the West, which is known nowhere else on the face of the globe, and in which the mortality in some years reaches 40%. Of course I was at once called in. I did my best for the patient, which was very little. I tried hard, however, to keep his wife sober, and to compel her to nurse him judiciously. As for little Charlie, I took him home with me to my own house, where he remained until his father was so far convalescent as to prevent all fear of infection. Meanwhile I knew nothing about Gagtooth's money, having been deposited in the hands of his employers, and consequently was ignorant of his loss. I did not learn this circumstance for weeks afterwards, and of course had no reason for supposing that his wife was in any wise straitened for money. Once, when her husband had been prostrated for about a fortnight, I saw her with a roll of banknotes in her hand. Little did I suspect how they had been obtained. Shortly after my patient had begun to sit up in his armchair for a little while every day, he begged so hard for little Charlie's presence that, as soon as I was satisfied that all danger of infection was past, I consented to allow the child to return to his own home. In less than a month afterwards the invalid was able to walk out in the garden for a few minutes every day when the weather was favourable, and in these walks Charlie was his constant companion. The affection of the poor fellow for his flaxen-haired darling was manifested in every glance of his eye and in every tone of his voice. He would kiss the little chap and pat him on the head 100 times a day. He would tell him stories until he himself was completely exhausted, and although I knew that this tended to retard his complete recovery, I had not the heart to forbid it. I have often since felt thankful that I never made any attempt to do so. At last the 15th of September arrived. On the morning of that day, Messrs. Rockwell and Dunbar's combined circus and menagerie made a triumphal entry into Peoria, and was to exhibit on the green down by the river bank. The performance had been ostentatiously advertised and placarded on every dead wall in town for a month back, and all the children in the place, little Charlie included, were wild on the subject. Signor Martigny was to enter a den containing 3 full-grown lions, and was to go through the terrific and disgusting ordeal usual on such occasions. Gagtooth, of course, was unable to go, but being unwilling to deny his child any reasonable pleasure, he had consented to Charlie's going with his mother. I happened to be passing the house on my way homewards to dinner, just as the pair were about to start, and called in to say good-bye to my patient. Never shall I forget the embrace and the kiss which a father bestowed upon the little fellow. I can see them now, after all these years, almost as distinctly as I saw them on that terrible 15th of September, 1855. They perfectly clung to each other, and seemed unwilling to part even for the 2 or 3 hours during which the performance was to last. I can see the mother, too, impatiently waiting in the doorway, and telling Charlie that if he didn't stop that nonsense they would be too late to see Samson killing the lion. She, heaven help her, thought nothing and cared nothing about the pleasure the child was to derive from the entertainment. She was only anxious on her own account, impatient to show her good looks and her cheap finery to the 2,000 and odd people assembled under the huge tent. At last they started. Gagtooth got up and walked to the door, following them with his eye as far as he could see them down the dusty street. Then he returned and sat down in his chair. Poor fellow, he was destined never to see either of them alive again. Notwithstanding her fear lest she might not arrive in time for the commencement of the performance, Mrs. Fink and her charge reached the ground at least half an hour before the ticket office was opened, and I regret to say that that half hour was sufficient to enable her to form an acquaintance with one of the property men of the establishment, to whom she contrived to make herself so agreeable that he passed her and Charlie into the tent free of charge. She was not admitted at the front entrance, but from the tiring room at the back, whence the performers entered. She sat down just at the left of this entrance, immediately adjoining the lion's cage. Ere long the performance commenced. Signor Martigny, when his turn came, entered the cage as per announcement, but he was not long in discovering by various signs not to be mistaken that his charges were in no humour to be played with on that day. Even the ringmaster from his place in the centre of the ring perceived that old king of the forest, the largest and most vicious of the lions, was meditating mischief, and called to the signor to come out of the cage. The signor, keeping his eyes steadily fixed on the brute, began a retrograde movement from the den. He had the door open, and was swiftly backing through, when, with a roar that seemed to shake the very earth, old King sprang upon him from the opposite side of the cage, dashing him to the ground like a ninepin, and rushed through the aperture into the crowd. Quick as lightning the other two followed, and thus 3 savage lions were loose and unshackled in the midst of upwards of 2,000 men, women, and children. I wish to linger over the details as briefly as possible. I am thankful to say that I was not present, and that I am unable to describe the occurrence from personal observation. Poor little Charlie and his mother, sitting close to the cage, were the very first victims. The child himself, I think, and hope, never knew what hurt him. His skull was fractured by one stroke of the brute's paw. Signor Martigny escaped with his right arm slit to ribbons. Big Joe Pendleton, the clown, with one well-directed stroke of a crowbar, smashed old King of the Forest's jaw into 100 pieces, but not before it had closed in the left breast of Charlie's mother. She lived for nearly an hour afterwards, but never uttered a syllable. I wonder if she was conscious. I wonder if it was permitted to her to realize what her sin, for sin it must have been, in contemplation, if not in deed, had brought upon herself and her child. Had she paid her way into the circus and entered in front, instead of coquetting with the property man, she would have been sitting under a different part of the tent, and neither she nor Charlie would have sustained any injury, for the 2 younger lions were shot before they had leapt 10 paces from the cage door. Old King was easily dispatched after Joe Pendleton's tremendous blow. Besides Charlie and his mother, 2 men and 1 woman were killed on the spot. Another woman died next day from the injuries received, and several other persons were more or less severely hurt. Immediately after dinner I had driven out into the country to pay a professional visit, so that I heard nothing about what had occurred until some hours afterwards. I was informed of it, however, before I reached the town on my way homeward. To say that I was inexpressibly shocked and grieved would merely be to repeat a very stupid platitude, and to say that I was a human being. I had learned to love poor little Charlie almost as dearly as I loved my own children, and his father. What would be the consequence to him? I drove direct to his house, which was filled with people, neighbours, and others who had called to administer such consolation as the circumstances would admit of. I am not ashamed to confess that the moment my eyes rested upon the bereaved father, I burst into tears. He sat with his child's body in his lap, and seemed literally transformed into stone. A breeze came in through the open doorway and stirred his thin iron grey locks as he sat there in his armchair. He was unconscious of everything, even of the presence of strangers. His eyes were fixed and glazed. Not a sound of any kind, not even a moan, passed his lips. And it was only after feeling his pulse that I was able to pronounce with certainty that he was alive. One single gleam of animation overspread his features for an instant, when I gently removed the crushed corpse from his knees and laid it on the bed, but he quickly relapsed into stolidity. I was informed that he had sat thus ever since he had first received the corpse from the arms of Joe Pendleton, who had brought it home without changing his clown's dress. Heaven grant that I may never look upon such a sight again as the poor half-recovered invalid presented during the whole of that night and for several days afterwards. For the next 3 days I spent all the time with him I possibly could, for I dreaded either a relapse of the fever or the loss of his reason. The neighbours were very kind, and took upon themselves the burden of everything connected with the funeral. As for Fink himself, he seemed to take everything for granted, and interfered with nothing. When the time arrived for fastening down the coffin lids, I could not bear to permit that ceremony to be performed without affording him an opportunity of kissing the dead lips of his darling for the last time. I gently led him up the side of the bed upon which the two coffins were placed. At sight of his little boy's dead face he fainted, and before he revived I had the lids fastened down. It would have been cruelty to subject him to the ordeal a second time. The day after the funeral he was sufficiently recovered from the shock to be able to talk. He informed me that he had concluded to leave the neighbourhood, and requested me to draw up a poster advertising all his furniture and effects for sale by auction. He intended, he said, to sell everything except Charlie's clothes and his own, and these, together with a lock of the child's hair and a few of his toys, were all he intended to take away with him. "But of course," I remarked, "you don't intend to sell the stone likeness?" He looked at me rather strangely, and made no reply. I glanced around the room, and, to my surprise, the little statue was nowhere to be seen. It then occurred to me that I had not noticed it since Gagtooth had taken ill. "By the by, where is it?" I inquired. "I don't see it." After a moment's hesitation he told me the whole story. It was then that I learned for the first time that he had lost all his savings through the failure of Messrs. Gowanlock and Van Duzer, and that the morning when he had been taken ill there had been only $1 in the house. On that morning he had acquainted his wife with his loss, but had strictly enjoined secrecy upon her, as both Gowanlock and Van Duzer had promised him most solemnly that inasmuch as they regarded their indebtedness to him as being upon a different footing from their ordinary liabilities, he would assuredly be paid in full out of the first money at their command. He had implicit reliance upon their word, and requested me to take charge of the money upon its arrival, and to keep it until he instructed me, by post or otherwise, how to dispose of it. To this I of course consented. The rest of the story he could only repeat upon the authority of his wife, but I have no reason for disbelieving any portion of it. It seems that a day or two after his illness commenced, and after he had become insensible, his wife had been at her wits' end for money to provide necessaries for the house, and I dare say she spent more for liquor than for necessaries. She declared that she had made up her mind to apply to me for a loan, when a stranger called at the house, attracted, as he said, by the little image which had been placed in the front window, and was thus visible to passers-by. He announced himself as Mr. Silas Pomeroy, merchant of Myrtle Street, Springfield. He said that the face of the little image strikingly reminded him of the face of a child of his own which had died some time before. He had not supposed that the figure was a likeness of anyone, and had stepped in upon the impulse of the moment in the hope that he might be able to purchase it. He was willing to pay a liberal price. The negotiation ended in his taking the image away with him, and leaving $100 in its stead, on which sum Mrs. Fink had kept house ever since. Her husband, of course, knew nothing of this for weeks afterwards. When he began to get better, his wife had acquainted him with the facts. He had found no fault with her, as he had determined to repurchase the image at any cost, so soon as he might be able to earn money enough. As for getting a duplicate, that was out of the question, for Heber Jackson had been carried off by the typhoid epidemic, and Charlie had changed considerably during the 15 months which had elapsed since the image had been finished, and now poor little Charlie himself was gone, and the great desire of his father's heart was to regain possession of the image. With that view, as soon as the sale should be over, he would start for Springfield, tell his story to Pomeroy, and offer him his money back again. As to any further plans, he did not know, he said, what he would do or where he would go, but he would certainly never live in Peoria again. In a few days the sale took place, and Gagtooth started for Springfield with about $300 in his pocket. Springfield is 70 miles from Peoria. He was to return in about 10 days, by which time a tombstone was to be ready for Charlie's grave. He had not ordered one for his wife, who was not buried in the same grave with the child, but in one just beside him. He returned within the 10 days. His journey had been a fruitless one. Pomeroy had become insolvent and had absconded from Springfield a month before. No one knew whither he had gone, but he must have taken the image with him, as it was not among the effects which he had left behind him. His friends knew that he was greatly attached to the image in consequence of its real or fancied resemblance to his dead child. Nothing more reasonable than to suppose that he had taken it away with him. Gagtooth announced to me his determination of starting on an expedition to find Pomeroy, and never giving up the search while his money held out. He had no idea where to look for the fugitive, but rather thought he would try California first. He could hardly expect to receive any remittance from Gowanlock and Van Duzer for some months to come, but he would acquaint me with his address from time to time, and if anything arrived from them, I could forward it to him. And so, having seen the tombstone set up over little Charlie's grave, he bade me good-bye, and that was the last time I ever saw him alive. There is little more to tell. I supposed him to be in the far west, prosecuting his researches until one night in the early spring of the following year. Charlie and his mother had been interred in a corner of the churchyard adjoining the Second Baptist Church, which at that time was on the very outskirts of the town, in a lonely, unfrequented spot not far from the Iron Bridge. Late in the evening of the 7th of April, 1856, a woman passing along the road in the cold, dim twilight saw a bulky object stretched out on Charlie's grave. She called at the nearest house and stated her belief that a man was lying dead in the churchyard. Upon investigation, her surmise proved to be correct, and that man was Gagtooth. Dead. Partially, no doubt, from cold and exposure, but chiefly, I believe, from a broken heart. Where he had spent the 6 months which had elapsed since I bade him farewell. To this question I am unable to reply, but this much was evident. He had dragged himself back just in time to die on the grave of the little boy whom he had loved so dearly, and whose brief existence had probably supplied the one bright spot in his father's life. I had him buried in the same grave with Charlie, and there, on the banks of the Illinois River. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. I never received any remittance from his former employers, nor did I ever learn anything further of Silas Pomeroy. Indeed, so many years have rolled away since the occurrence of the events above narrated, years pregnant with great events to the American Republic, events, I am proud to say, in which I bore my part, that the wear and tear of life had nearly obliterated all memory of the episode from my mind, until, as detailed in the opening paragraphs of this story, I saw Gagtooth's image from the top of a Thornhill omnibus. That image is now in my possession, and no extremity less urgent than that under which it was sold to Silas Pomeroy of Myrtle Street, Springfield, will ever induce me to part with it. End of chapter 4. End of Gagtooth's image.
One and 2 of The Haunted House on Duchess Street. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. The Haunted House on Duchess Street. Being a narration of certain strange events alleged to have taken place at York, Upper Canada,
in or about the year 1823. O'er all there hung the shadow of a fear, a sense of mystery the spirit daunted, and said, as plain as whisper in the ear, the place is haunted. Hood. Chapter 1. Outside the House. I suppose there are at least a score of persons living in Toronto at the present moment who remember that queer old house on Duchess Street. Not that there was anything specially remarkable about the house itself, which indeed in its best days presented an aspect of rather snug respectability, but the events I am about to relate invested it with an evil reputation, and made it an object to be contemplated at a safe distance, rather than from any near approach. Youngsters on their way to school were wont to eye it askance as they hurried by on their way to their daily tasks. Even children of a larger growth manifested no unbecoming desire to penetrate too curiously into its inner mysteries. And for years its threshold was seldom or never crossed by anybody except Simon Washburn or some of his clerks, who about once in every 12th month made a quiet entry upon the premises and placed in the front windows announcements to the effect that the place was for sale or to let. The printing of these announcements involved a useless expenditure of capital, for, from the time when the character of the house became matter of notoriety, no one could be induced to try the experiment of living in it. In the case of a house, no less than in that of an individual, a bad name is more easily gained than lost, and in the case of the house on Duchess Street, its uncanny repute clung to it with a persistent grasp which time did nothing to relax. It was distinctly and emphatically a place to keep away from. The house was originally built by one of the Ridout family, I think by the Surveyor General himself, soon after the close of the War of 1812, and it remained intact until a year or two after the town of York became the city of Toronto, when it was partly demolished and converted into a more profitable investment. The new structure, which was a shingle or stave factory, was burned down in 1843 or 1844, and the site thenceforward remained unoccupied until comparatively recent times. When I visited the spot a few weeks since, I encountered not a little difficulty in fixing upon the exact site, which is covered by an unprepossessing row of dark red brick presenting the aspect of having stood there from time immemorial, though, as I am informed, the houses have been erected within the last quarter of a century. Unattractive as they appear, however, they are the least uninviting feature in the landscape, which is prosaic and squalid beyond description. Rickety, tumble-down tenements of dilapidated lath and plaster stare the beholder in the face at every turn. During the greater part of the day the solitude of the neighbourhood remains unbroken, save by the tread of some chance wayfarer like myself, and a general atmosphere of the abomination of desolation reigns supreme. Passing along the unfrequented pavement, one finds it difficult to realize the fact that this was once a not unfashionable quarter of the capital of Upper Canada. The old house stood 40 or 50 feet back from the roadway, on the north side, overlooking the waters of the bay. The lot was divided from the street by a low picket fence, and admission to the enclosure was gained by means of a small gate. In those remote times there were few buildings intervening between Duchess Street and the waterfront, and those few were not very pretentious, so when the atmosphere was free from fog, you could trace from the windows of the upper story the entire hithermost shore of the peninsula, which has since become the island. The structure itself, like most buildings then erected in York, was of frame. It was of considerable dimensions for those days, and must have contained at least 8 or 9 rooms. It was 2 stories high, and had a good deal of painted fretwork about the windows of the upper story. A stately elm stood immediately in the rear, and its wide-spreading branches overshadowed the greater part of the backyard and outbuildings. And that is all I have been able to learn about the exterior aspect of the place. Chapter 2. Inside the House. A small porch door, about halfway down the western side, furnished the ordinary mode of entrance to and exit from the house. This door opened into an apartment which served the double purpose of sitting room and dining room, and which was connected by an inner door with the kitchen and back premises. There was, however, a rather wide-mouthed front entrance, approached by a short flight of wooden steps, and opening into a fair-sized hall. To the right of the hall, as you entered, a door opened into what served as a drawing-room, which was seldom used, as the occupants of the house were not given to receiving much fashionable company. To the left of the hall, another door opened into the dining-room already mentioned. A stairway facing the front entrance conducted you to the upper story, which consisted of several bedrooms and a large apartment in front. This latter must have been by long odds the pleasantest room in the house. It was of comfortable dimensions, well lighted, and cheerful as to its outlook. 2 front windows commanded a prospect of the bay and the peninsula, while a third window on the eastern side overlooked the valley of the Don, which was by no means the stagnant pool which it was destined to become in later years. The only entrance to this chamber was a door placed directly to the right hand at the head of the stairway, which stairway, it may be mentioned, consisted of exactly 17 steps. A small bedroom in the rear was accessible only by a separate door at the back of the upper hallway, and was thus not directly connected with the larger apartment. I am not informed as to the precise number and features of the other rooms in the upper story, except that they were bedrooms, nor is any further information respecting them essential to a full comprehension of the narrative. Why I have been so precise as to what may at first appear trivial details will hereafter appear. End of Chapter 2. Of the Haunted House on Duchess Street. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by Charles Dent. The Haunted House on Duchess Street, Chapter 3. The Tenants of the House. As already mentioned, the house was probably built by Surveyor General Ridout, but it does not appear that either he or any member of his family ever resided there. The earliest occupant of whom I have been able to find any trace was Thomas Mercer Jones, the gentleman, I presume, who was afterwards connected with the Canada Land Company. Whether he was the first tenant I am unable to say, but a gentleman bearing that name dwelt there during the latter part of the year 1816, and appears to have been a well-known citizen of Little York. In 1819 the tenant was a person named McKechnie, as to whom I have been unable to glean any information whatever, beyond the bare fact that he was a pew holder in St. James's Church. He appears to have given place to one of the numerous members of the Powell family. But the occupant with whom this narrative is more immediately concerned was a certain ex-military man named Bywater, who woke up the echoes of York society for a few brief months, between 60 and 70 years ago, and who, after passing a lurid interval of his misspent life in this community, solved the great problem of human existence by falling downstairs and breaking his neck. Captain Stephen Bywater was a mauvais sujet of the most pronounced stamp. He came of a good family in one of the Midland counties of England, entered the army at an early age, and was present on a certain memorable Sunday at Waterloo, on which occasion he is said to have borne himself gallantly and well. But he appears to have had a deep vein of ingrained vice in his composition, which perpetually impelled him to crooked paths. Various ugly stories were current about him, for all of which there was doubtless more or less foundation. It was said that he had been caught cheating at play, and that he was an adept in all the rascalities of the turf. The deplorable event which led to the resignation of his commission made considerable noise at the time of its occurrence. A young brother officer, whom he had swindled out of large sums of money, was forced by him into a duel, which was fought on the French coast, in the presence of 2 seconds and a military surgeon. There seems to have been no doubt that the villainous captain fired too soon. At any rate, the youth who had been inveigled into staking his life on the issue was left dead on the field, while the aggressor strode off unscathed, followed by the execrations of his own second. A rigid enquiry was instituted, but the principal witnesses were not forthcoming, and the murderer, for as such he was commonly regarded, escaped the punishment which everybody considered he had justly merited. The severance of his connection with the army was a foregone conclusion, and he was formally expelled from his club. He was socially sent to Coventry, and his native land soon became for him a most undesirable place of abode. Then he crossed the Atlantic and made his way to Upper Canada, where after a while he turned up at York, and became the tenant of the house on Duchess Street. At the time of his arrival in this country, which must have been sometime in 1822, or perhaps early 1823, Captain Bywater was apparently about 40 years of age. He was a bachelor and possessed of some means. For a very brief period he contrived to make his way into the select society of the provincial capital, but it soon became known that he was the aristocratic desperado who had so ruthlessly shot down young Remy Errington on the sands near Boulogne, and who had the reputation of being one of the most unmitigated scamps who ever wore a uniform. York society in those days could swallow a good deal in a man of good birth and competent fortune, but it could not swallow even a well-to-do bachelor of good family and marriageable age who had been forced to resign his commission, and who had been expelled from a not too straight-laced London club by a unanimous vote of the committee. Captain Bywater was dropped with a suddenness and severity which he could not fail to understand. He received no more invitations from mothers with marriageable daughters, and when he presented himself at their doors informally and forbidden, he found nobody at home. Ladies ceased to recognize him on the street, and gentlemen received his bows with a response so frigid that he readily comprehended the state of affairs. He perceived that his day of grace was past, and accepted his fate with a supercilious shrug of his broad shoulders. But the captain was a gregarious animal, to whom solitude was insupportable. Society of some sort was a necessity of his existence, and as the company of ladies and gentlemen was no longer open to him, he sought consolation among persons of a lower grade in the social scale. He began to frequent bar-rooms and other places of public resort, and as he was free with his money he had no difficulty in finding companions of a certain sort who were ready and willing enough to drink at his expense, and to listen to the braggadocio tales of the doughty deeds achieved by him during his campaign in the peninsula. In a few weeks he found himself the acknowledged head and front of a little coterie which assembled nightly at the George Inn on King Street. This, however, did not last long, as the late potations and ribald carousings of the company disturbed the entire neighbourhood and attracted attention to the place. The landlord received a stern admonition to keep earlier hours and less uproarious guests. When Boniface sought to carry this admonition into effect, Captain Bywater mounted his high horse and adjourned to his own place, taking his 5 or 6 boon companions with him. From that time forward, the house on Duchess Street was the regular place of meeting. End of Chapter 3. The Haunted House on Duchess Street. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. The Haunted House on Duchess Street, Chapter 4. The Orgies in the House. Captain Bywater, upon his first arrival at York, had taken up his quarters at a public house. The York inns of the period had an unenviable reputation, and were widely different from the Queen's and Rosin of the present day. Some of my readers will doubtless remember John Gates's savage fling at them several years later. To parody Dr. Johnson's characterization of the famous leg of mutton, they were ill-looking, ill-smelling, ill-provided, and ill-kept. In a word, they were unendurable places of sojourn for a man of fastidious tastes and sensitive nerves. Perhaps the captain's tastes were fastidious, though I can hardly believe that his nerves were sensitive. Possibly he wished to furnish clear evidence that he was no mere sojourner in a strange land, but that he had come here with a view to permanent settlement. At all events, his stay at an inn was of brief duration. He rented the house on Duchess Street and furnished it in a style which for those days might be called expensive, more especially for a bachelor's establishment. The greater part of the furniture was sent up from Montreal, and the captain proclaimed his intention of giving a grand housewarming at an early date. He had hardly become settled in the place, however, before his character and antecedent life became known, as already mentioned, and the project was abandoned. His household consisted of a manservant named Jim Summers, whom he had picked up at Montreal, and the wife of the latter, who enjoyed the reputation of being an excellent cook, in which capacity she was afterwards employed at the Government House during the régime of Sir John Colborne. At first this couple had a tolerably easy time of it. The captain was not exigent, and allowed them to run the establishment pretty much as they chose. He always rose late and went out immediately after breakfast, accompanied by his large Newfoundland dog Nero, an only living possession he had brought with him from beyond the sea. Master and dog were seen no more until dinner time, which was 5 o'clock. Between 7 and 8 in the evening the pair would betake themselves to the George, where the captain drank and howled himself hoarse until long past midnight. But he was a seasoned vessel, and generally had pretty fair control over his limbs. He could always find his way home without assistance, and used to direct his man not to wait up for him. The dog was his companion whenever he stirred out of doors. But when the venue was changed from the tap-room of the George Inn to the captain's own house, the troubles of Jim Summers and his wife began. The guests commonly arrived within a few minutes of each other, and were all in their places by 8 o'clock. They met in the large upper room, and their sessions were prolonged far into the night, or rather into the morning, for it happened often enough that daylight peeped in through the eastern window and found the company still undispersed. Ribald jests, drunken laughter, and obscene songs were kept up the whole night through. The quantity of rum, whiskey, brandy, and beer consumed in the course of a week must have been something to wonder at. The refreshments were provided at the expense of the host, and as it was Jim's business to keep up the supply of spirits, lemons and hot water, he had no sinecure on his hands. It might well be supposed that he might, if so minded, have found a more congenial situation, but as a matter of fact he was not over scrupulous as to the nature of his employment, and probably had his full share of the fun. The captain paid good wages, and was lavish in gratuities when he was in good humour. On the whole, Jim considered that he had not such a bad place of it, and was by no means disposed to quarrel with his bread and butter. His wife took a different view of affairs, and ere long refused to remain on the premises during the nightly orgies. This difficulty was got over by an arrangement whereby she was permitted to quit the house at 8 o'clock in the evening, returning on the following morning in time to prepare the captain's breakfast. She spent her nights with a married sister who lived a short distance away, and by this means she avoided what to any woman of respectability must have been an unbearable infliction. The orgies, in process of time, became a reproach to the neighbourhood and a scandal to the town. They were, however, kept up with few interruptions for several months. More than one townsman declared that so intolerable a nuisance must be abated, but no one liked to be the first to stir in such an unpleasant business, and the Bacchanalians continued to vex with mirth the drowsy ear of night, unchecked by more cleanly living citizens. But just about the time when these carousings had become absolutely intolerable to the community, they were put a stop to without any outside interference. End of chapter 4.